The year is 1343. A crowd gathers at the gates of Nantes, their eyes fixed on a gruesome spectacle mounted high on a pike. It is the severed head of a beloved nobleman rotting in the sun. Standing beneath it is not a weeping widow, trembling in grief. It is a mother, holding the hands of her two young sons, forcing them to stare into the dead eyes of their father. She isn't crying. She is making a promise. In that moment, the noblewoman Jeanne de Clisson died, and the Lioness of Brittany was born. This isn't a fairy tale of damsels in distress. This is the story of how one woman sold everything she owned to buy a fleet of black ships, painted her sails the color of blood, and hunted down the King of France like prey. History tells us that well-behaved women seldom make history, but Jeanne de Clisson wasn't just misbehaved, she was a nightmare fueled by pure vengeance. While other widows prayed for their husbands' souls, Jeanne sharpened her axe. She would go on to become one of the most feared pirates to ever sail the English Channel, earning a reputation so terrifying that French sailors whispered her name like a curse. But before the blood, before the black ships, and before the terror, she was just a woman in love, living in a world that was about to betray her in the most brutal way imaginable. To understand the monster she became, we first have to understand the heart that was broken. Because the lioness didn't just appear out of nowhere. She was forged in the fires of a political betrayal that shattered the rules of medieval chivalry. And it all started with a tournament, a truce, and a king who didn't know who he was messing with. Brittany in the 14th century was a powder keg. The War of the Breton Succession had torn the land apart, with the French backing one claimant and the English backing another. It was a messy, bloody Game of Thrones, but amidst the chaos, Jeanne had found stability. After a tragic first marriage and a scandalous annulment, she found true happiness with her third husband, Olivier de Clisson. He was wealthy, powerful, and by all accounts, the love of her life. They were a power couple, navigating the dangerous politics of the time with skill and grace. But happiness in the Middle Ages was a fragile thing. Olivier fought valiantly for the French cause, even getting captured in battle. When he was released by the English for a suspiciously low ransom, whispers began to circulate. The French king, Philip VI, was a paranoid man. He looked at Olivier's release not as luck, but as evidence of treason. He convinced himself that Olivier had made a secret deal with the English. So, King Philip set a trap. He invited Olivier and other lords to a grand tournament in Paris. It was meant to be a celebration of a truce, a time of peace and chivalry. Olivier rode to Paris expecting jousts and feasting. Instead, he walked straight into the executioner's waiting arms. The betrayal was absolute. There was no fair trial. There was no evidence. King Philip simply wanted to send a message. Olivier was arrested, dragged in chains to Les Halles, and beheaded in front of a cheering crowd. But the king wasn't done. He wanted to humiliate the Clisson family. He ordered Olivier's body to be hung from a gibbet in Paris, a punishment usually reserved for common criminals, not noble knights. Then, in a final act of cruelty, he sent Olivier's head back to Brittany to be displayed on a spike at the Sauvetout Gate. When the news reached Jeanne, something inside her snapped. The king expected her to retreat into a convent or beg for mercy. Instead, she took her two young sons, Olivier and William, on a grim pilgrimage. She marched them to the city gate and made them memorize the face of their father's murder. She etched the hatred into their souls. That day, she swore an oath of eternal vengeance against Philip VI and the entire French nobility. She sold her jewelry, she sold her furniture, she sold her lands. She liquidated her entire life to raise an army. The King of France had taken her husband. Now, she was going to take his kingdom. Peace by bloody peace. Jeanne's war began on land. She gathered a small band of loyal soldiers, men who were just as disgusted by the king's treachery as she was. They didn't target military outposts. They targeted the king's friends. In a move that shocked the nobility, Jeanne approached the French-held castle of Tuffeau. She played the part of the grieving, helpless widow, weeping at the gates until the guards let her in. The moment the gates opened, the act dropped. Her men swarmed the castle. It was a massacre. They slaughtered the entire garrison, showing no mercy to the soldiers who served the king. But amidst the carnage, Jeanne established her signature move. She left one man alive, not out of kindness, but out of calculation. She needed a messenger to run back to King Philip and tell him exactly who had done this. But land warfare was too slow for the lioness. The King of France was powerful on the ground, but the sea was lawless. Jeanne took the rest of her fortune and crossed the Channel to England. She found a willing ally in King Edward III, who was more than happy to help a woman who hated the French as much as he did. With English gold and her own fury, she built a fleet that would become the stuff of nightmares. She purchased 3 warships, but she didn't want them to look like ordinary vessels. She ordered the hulls painted pitch black, blending into the dark waters of the Channel at night. The sails were dyed a deep blood red. It was psychological warfare. When French sailors saw the red sails on the horizon, they knew death was coming. She named her flagship with a single word that defined her existence: my revenge. The Black Fleet patrolled the English Channel, hunting French commerce ships. This wasn't about stealing cargo for profit. This was about bleeding the French economy dry. Jeanne and her crew would board the ships, overpowering the terrified sailors. And this is where the legend of the lioness truly takes shape. Jeanne didn't stay on the quarterdeck shouting orders. She was on the front lines. Accounts tell us she wielded an axe, stalking the deck of captured ships. She personally beheaded French noblemen she found on board. She was judge, jury, and executioner. And just like at the castle, she always left 2 or 3 sailors alive to carry the message back to Paris. The lioness is coming for you. For 13 years, the Black Fleet terrorized the coast. The King of France, Philip VI, was furious, but he was powerless to stop her. She struck from the mist, destroyed his supply lines, and vanished before his navy could catch her. She even raided coastal villages in Normandy, burning them to the ground and slaughtering the inhabitants. She had become a force of nature, a hurricane of vengeance that refused to burn out. She even aided the English during major conflicts, ferrying supplies to their troops during the Battle of Crécy. She had transformed from a scorned wife into a geopolitical player, using her rage to tilt the balance of the 100 Years' War. But the sea is a cruel mistress, and luck eventually runs out. In 1356, after more than a decade of piracy, her flagship was cornered. A storm of French arrows and heavy seas overwhelmed my revenge. The ship that had been the instrument of her hate began to sink beneath the waves. Jeanne, now in her 50s, was forced into a lifeboat with her 2 sons. For 5 days, they drifted. No food, no water, just the bitter cold of the English Channel. It was here that the tragedy of her life came full circle. Her youngest son, William, the boy she had taken to see his father's head, could not survive the exposure. He died in the boat, his body cold in his mother's arms. Jeanne had taken her revenge, but the cost was her child. She and her surviving son, Olivier, were eventually rescued and taken to England. Broken but alive, Jeanne finally laid down her axe. She retired to the castle of Hennebont in Brittany, marrying an English lieutenant named Walter Bentley. It was a quiet end to a life of screaming violence. She died in 1359, leaving behind a legacy that felt more like a myth than history. Her son, Olivier, however, did not forget. He grew up to become a brutal warrior known as the Butcher, continuing the family tradition of making the French bleed. The story of Jeanne de Clisson is a reminder that the damsel in distress narrative is often a lie. When pushed to the brink, stripped of her rights, and denied justice, she didn't collapse. She carved a path of destruction that forced kings to tremble. She proved that grief is a powerful weapon, and that a mother's love can be as deadly as it is nurturing. Today, locals say her ghost still haunts the ruins of Clisson Castle, a gray lady watching over the home she lost. Perhaps she is still waiting for an apology from a king long dead. So, the next time you hear about pirates, Don't just think of Blackbeard or Jack Sparrow. Think of the French noblewoman in the black ship with red sails, axe in hand, screaming for revenge. If you enjoyed this tale of medieval vengeance, hit that subscribe button for more dark history.